The US and Ukraine say they have agreed to work on an updated and refined version of a peace plan put forward by Washington after a day of high-stakes diplomacy in Geneva. The White House described the discussions in Switzerland as a significant step forward, while Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said there were signals that President Trump's team was listening to Kyiv.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on his way to meet Ukrainian and other European officials in Geneva early on Sunday. A chance for Washington to finalize its 28-point plan to end the war in Ukraine. A plan that has alarmed Kyiv's European allies and some U.S. lawmakers for its concessions to Russia, including Kyiv ceding territory to Moscow. As the talks got underway, media got a glimpse of who was present inside the negotiations, but by the end of the day, little was revealed about what was discussed.
So I'm not going to speculate or go into the details of any of the specific items in the latest version of the proposal because, frankly, by tomorrow or the next day, that may have evolved and changed further. And but I can tell you, I guess, that I feel very optimistic that we can get something done here because we made a tremendous amount of progress today.
That positive tone was echoed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation in Geneva, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had this to say.
The delegation has just reported on the results of their discussions, and these were substantive conversations. A lot is changing. We are working very carefully on the steps needed to end the war.
An assessment on just how those discussions may have gone came in a later joint US-Ukraine statement. It said that a refined peace framework had been drafted following the talks and stated that any future agreement must fully uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and deliver a sustainable and just peace. Terms that may well concern Russia, who would have to sign off on any agreement hammered out between Washington and Kyiv.
Right, let's get more on this from our correspondents in Ukraine and Switzerland. Nick Connolly is in Odessa and Jack Parrock has been covering these talks in Geneva. So let's begin with you first, Jack. Do you get a sense now that the US, Ukraine and the EU are on the same page when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine?
Hard to tell whether they're on the same page, but what they're saying is the right kind of things. The Ukrainians and the Americans looked positive. We definitely saw that from Marco Rubio. We also saw it from Andrei Yermak, the Ukrainian head of delegation. But what's interesting about these talks that were cobbled together at last minute, everybody rushed into Geneva on Saturday night for the talks that took place throughout Sunday, is that the main event really was the direct talks between the Americans and the Ukrainians. But prior to that, the Ukrainians had been meeting with representatives from the European side, so the Brits, the French, the Italians, and the Germans, and some representatives from the European Union as well. But these talks and this agreement, this mood music, isn't all of those, not the Americans and the Europeans and the Ukrainians. And in fact, the Europeans responded to Trump's so-called 28-point peace plan with their own 28 points that they've responded, which include not ceding Ukrainian territory to Russia and not reducing the military to the extent that Donald Trump, the US president, had wanted. Now, the talks wrapped up here. As I say, it was quite a shambolic day yesterday, everybody running between different locations, but they have wrapped up and they seem positive. So a lot of people are hoping that that's a good sign for peace in the long run.
I do want to come back to you about the European version of this plan, but let's just go to Nick before that. Nick, what's been the reaction in Ukraine to this day of talks?
Certainly, in terms of official reactions, it's all about gratitude to Donald Trump and basically towing the polite line. That has been the lesson for Ukraine's politicians since Donald Trump got back into the White House. Do not say anything that can be construed as a lack of gratitude. Do not contradict him in public, and then let the Europeans say out loud what you're thinking in terms of quite how bad this plan is. I think for now they're going to go along with it. They are very, very worried about the blame game, about being blamed by DC and obviously by the Russians for this war continuing. There's still huge skepticism whether actually anything will change, but they have to be seen to be engaging. And they are hoping that Ukraine's allies in Washington, more, let's say, mainstream Republicans will also push Trump. We've heard from Trump recently this is not his last offer. Sounds like back in a casino, and it seems like all of these points are still very much up for grabs. There seems a really clear point now that the American side doesn't have any real principled attachment to any of these points. It's all about getting this done in a hurry and potentially getting a Nobel Prize for Donald Trump. So I think for now it's about holding the nerve and letting the Europeans do the unpleasant stuff in public and hoping that this kind of passes.
Jack, let's talk about the Europeans, because you were saying earlier that European officials were basically pushing back against the US president's this so-called peace proposal, and you were talking about this their own adapted plan that they presented. What are the salient points of that plan, do you know, and how influential would you say has Europe been along the way?
Well, the plan, it hasn't been publicly circulated yet, but we know that it has been sent to the Americans. And essentially, it outlines the same sort of 28 points, but with the red lines of the Europeans and the Ukrainians. Like I said, not ceding territory, not reducing the military so that Ukraine wouldn't be able to defend itself. The big question now is, how do the Europeans position themselves? Obviously, they've funded the Ukrainians to a large extent throughout the period of this war and supported politically massively. So now I think what we will expect is some sort of strengthening. There was the coalition of the willing, these discussions to keep going now amongst EU leaders. And they're also aware that Donald Trump set out this Thursday deadline for a deal to be done. So there is time pressure on here. But a number of the diplomats and officials that I've spoken to have said, listen, this deadline was sort of created by Donald Trump and it can be moved, and that the priorities and that the red lines, that they won't change just because there's a sort of arbitrary deadline of Thursday this week.
Nick, where does this leave Volodymyr Zelenskyy? Has the Ukrainian president's hand been strengthened in these past few days?
Well, that's the extraordinary thing about this, Paresh, that on the one hand, this looked incredibly bad for Ukraine when it kind of filtered out at the end of last week. Basically, it seemed like Donald Trump had decided to order the Ukrainians to capitulate. But on the other hand, in terms of domestic politics, it has basically saved him. It has, for now at least, delayed all talk of the VIP corruption scandal in the energy ministry that was also getting dangerously close to the head of his administration, Andriy Yermak, who's now in Geneva, basically heading Ukraine's delegation, and obviously is now untouchable for the foreseeable future because of that, even though lots of people here in Ukraine wanted him gone last week. And there is a real sense now that Zelenskyy and people around him are going to fight back and attack those very same anti-corruption organs that brought out these investigations last week and try and dampen things down and tell people this is not the time to rock the boat, keep quiet. I'm not sure that's going to work. Definitely maybe in the short term it will in terms of the kind of investigations, but I think Ukrainian public opinion has really bought into these investigations and is really following in a way that they don't normally, with kind of normal revelations that aren't quite as visceral and as kind of extraordinary as the ones we saw last week.
Nick Connolly in Odessa and Jack Parrock in Geneva. Thank you both so much.